Okay, well, I have 1 o'clock here in Central Time, so we will get started. We are recording today and we'll be posting this on our website just to let you know. As I mentioned a moment ago, we'll have our speakers here on video, and feel free to leave your video off otherwise, and we will get started. Thank you for joining us for the Accelerating Development of Reasoning and Judgment webinar today. We'll be talking about the habits and practices of effective fish and wildlife professionals, so we're glad you're joining us. Our agenda is welcome, objectives, and introductions. Oh, and as I hear a notification, I will encourage you to mute yourself when you're not talking, and then if you have a question, you can unmute yourself. So after we overview the objectives and the introductions, we'll talk a little bit about the background of all these resources. We'll look at the tools involved for individuals and teams, and we'll talk about how you can also use these in recruitment and selection. And then also after we go through all that, we'll talk about what's next and how the management assistance team can support you. And we'll be sure to leave time for questions at the end. And speaking of questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. We will either reply in the chat and or cover them as we go out loud so that folks can hear the answers they need. So our objectives today are to explain why and how these habits and practices of effective conservation professionals were identified, and to give an overview of the accelerating development of reasoning and judgment tools. There's a lot of stuff in there, so we want to walk through all the pieces with you. And then we want to help you start using these materials. So those are our 3 main objectives today. And on the webinar today, we have Ann Forstchen from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. We have Megan Baumer with Cornell University and the Wildlife Management Institute, Chris Smith, also from WMI, Bettina and myself, who are from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on the Management Assistance Team, and Lindsay Martinez, also with WMI. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ann, who will kick us off to talk a little bit about the background.
Okay, thanks, Kelly. Welcome, everybody. The success of fish and wildlife conservation depends on the performance of the professionals in our conservation organizations. And these professionals are under increasing pressure to perform at a high level as they find themselves facing increasingly complex management issues driven by rapid social and environmental changes. Agencies continue to lose their most seasoned upper-level managers and dedicated mentors to retirement amid higher expectations for agencies to provide more programs and services to more people with reduced agency resources. The purpose of our project was to figure out a way to hasten development of early and mid-career fish and wildlife professionals. Based on our observations from a series of workshops with wildlife professionals, our collective professional experience, and a literature review, we decided to focus on reasoning and judgment skills, as these are critical to good decision-making. We suggest that providing individual training is necessary but not sufficient to create work environments where wildlife professionals can develop and apply reasoning and judgment skills. Structural and cultural change in conservation agencies is also needed. So decisions are the core work of fish and wildlife professionals. Though many opportunities exist for leadership development, few focus on decision-making. In practice, developing reasoning and judgment skills is largely relegated to on-the-job training. So this work was conducted under a 2019 AFWA multi-state conservation grant awarded to the Wildlife Management Institute. We had a large project team that has broad and numerous years of experience in the conservation arena across the country. We were not aware of any previous inquiries that were designed to reveal how wildlife professionals develop their reasoning and judgment skills, probably one of the most fundamental skills for professional success. So to follow our project logic, we recognized that staff retirements were creating fewer opportunities for staff to observe and learn from their colleagues who demonstrated disciplined, reasoning, and good professional judgment. And these skills are mission critical given the rapidly changing social ecological system and increasingly diverse stakeholders. We concluded that accelerating the development of reasoning and judgment skills was vital. But first we had to identify the habits and practices of those consistently effective wildlife professionals before we could teach them to others. So in the spring of 2019, we conducted a 2-round expert panel process. Our team identified about 85 high-performing conservation professionals, and we also got some referrals from others in the conservation community. They came from 35 states that 35 states that represented state and federal agencies and some conservation NGOs, and came from all of the AFWA regions. Basically, we asked the question, how do highly effective fish and wildlife professions think? And what do they do? What are their habits and practices that result in them being regarded as consistently successful? And by successful, we mean consistently contributing to make well-reasoned, durable judgments that resolve both modest and complex problems. So 71 people responded to our inquiry about their habits and practices, and we dug in deeper with personal interviews with 19 of them. After analyzing all this information from these folks, we drafted a list of habits and practices. And we asked our expert panel to react to our findings, and we further refined that list. While our panel members found that having the list was useful in starting sort of discussions with supervisors and teams, we needed to develop some tools to make sure that we got these habits and practices into action. So we developed a handful of tools, which you'll hear about in a few minutes. And we tested these tools in 4 different workshops with a wide variety of wildlife professionals in Florida, Montana, Michigan, and New York. And so once we validated our tools, we began to communicate the findings of this work in the Wildlife Professional. And there's also a more technical paper that you can find at Cornell University at the Center for Conservation Social Science. So the next step was to provide wider access to this information and these tools, which is why we're here today. So briefly, the panelists helped us identify 30 habits and practices that contribute to the reasoning and judgment skills of consistently high-performing fish and wildlife professionals. And these fell into the 5 major clusters or groups of practices that you see here. There was some overlap between some of these clusters, and not unexpectedly, our panelists felt that all of the practices that were identified were moderately or very important to the development of their staff and could be applied at both the individual and at the organizational level. So I think, Kelly, we're going to move into the overview of the tools now.
Yes, thanks, Anne. And just to answer the question of who are these tools for, kind of as Anne was just speaking to, whether you're an individual, you can use them. If you're a team manager, you can use them, or a hiring manager as well, as Chris will speak to later. So with that, I'll hand it over to Megan to talk about the tools.
Advance, yeah, thanks. So I'm going to cover the set of tools we designed for an individual interested in self-improvement. They can be used by an individual on his or her own, although engaging a supervisor or a mentor or professional development specialist will make the process richer and more effective. So here's the full list of the individual tools. And all of these are available on the Management Assistant Team website, along with a detailed guidebook that covers all the information you need to use them. These tools are to be used as an aid for thinking about discussion of an individual's professional development and improvement. We just want to make note that they shouldn't be used to rate performance or compare scores across multiple people in your organization. This is a pictorial representation of how we envision the steps an individual would take in the process of using these tools. So the individual self-assessment tool, or the ISAT, is used for an individual to reflect on the habits and practices to identify strengths and areas of improvement. It can be used on its own, but we recommend combining it with other tools so you can gain additional insights. The next tool is the Context-Specific Assessment Tool, or CSAT, and that allows users to consider how their habits and practices were applied in a specific experience and can provide a much deeper evaluation of the habits and practices. After completing the ISAT and potentially the CSAT, it's recommended that individuals discuss these tools and responses with a supervisor or mentor. This can be a colleague, or if you prefer a third party, the management assistant team can serve as a mentor in the process. The next step is to create an individual professional development plan, an Ipdp, ideally with a mentor, to guide the efforts to improve alignment of habits and practices. We've created two versions of this, the task-oriented and the habit-oriented, depending on your needs and preferences. In order for this process to be most effective for improvement, it's recommended that the documents are reviewed periodically and perhaps retaken after a defined period of time. Now I'll go into the details of each tool. The ISAT assists an individual with identifying how well their habits and practices align with those of high-performing wildlife professionals. Review of the habits and practices, coupled with personal reflection on how consistently an individual applies each, can aid planning of professional development and self-improvement efforts. The tool can be completed online as a Google form, with the user getting an emailed copy of their responses. It consists of a series of statements that capture the important habits and practices identified by wildlife professionals in our study. Users are asked to reflect on how consistently they apply the habits and practices. After thinking about each statement, the user rates their application of each habit or practice indicated using a 3-point scale. If the ISAT is completed online, the management assistant team can see the responses and act as a mentor. If an individual wants to do a completely anonymous version of the ISAT, a PDF version is available for download on the MAT website. Now this one I didn't show on the original form, but it's like another version of the ISAT, or an additional thing you can do with other colleagues. So it's called the Multiple Perspective Assessment Tool, and it's very similar to the ISAT. But for this tool, in addition to completing their own ISAT, users and/or their mentor will select others to complete an assessment of the subject's habits and practices. This is similar to a 360-degree assessment. You'll note that the rest of the process is similar to the one I showed earlier for the ISAT, with the creation of an individual professional development plan and continued evaluation. It is recommended that input from the MPAT be sought from between 5 and 10 individuals to provide a broad enough range of views. Those chosen could include coworkers, team members, supervisors, mentors, or staff. Using the MPAT can provide a more complete understanding of an individual's habits and practices. Each person selected to complete an MPAT will do so independently. To ensure others' input is candid, the MPAT should be administered by someone other than the subject, and the person administering the tool should keep all responses in confidence. The data provided by others regarding the subject's habits and practices is returned to the person administering the MPAT. The individual's input is then compiled in an aggregate spreadsheet without attribution to the individuals who provided it. So each person selected to complete the MPAT can use an Excel template that we created to record their assessment of the individual. The statements are the same as the ISAT, but will have the individual's name as the referent. The person administering the MPAT will aggregate all the individual responses into a spreadsheet we created and remove the names. Once all the responses are in the spreadsheet, color-coded bar graphs for each habit and practice are automatically generated. These graphs can be used with the results of the ISAT to determine how closely others' perceptions align with the subject's own. The next step after the ISAT and potentially the MPAT is the context-specific assessment tool. This helps to evaluate the habits and practices within a specific work or job experience. It is similar to a case analysis. This tool is optional in the process, but it gives the user a deeper understanding of how the habits and practices were applied in the context of a specific experience. This case analysis is likely to provide additional insights useful for developing an individual professional development plan. To apply the tool, users should think of a recent experience that required the application of professional reasoning and judgment. This may be things such as a specific event, an ad hoc stakeholder interaction, or a long-term project. This template is available as a downloadable Word document on the Management Assistant team's website. A brief description of the experience should be written in the space provided at the top to keep focus on the experience as the rest of the form is completed. Keeping that experience in mind, the user will work through the list of habits and practices, carefully reflecting on his or her performance. The first column lists all the habits and practices. In the second column, the user should make note of how any of the habits and practices contributed to the outcome in a positive way. In the third column, the user notes any that were not applied optimally and how they could have been applied in ways that would likely have improved the outcome. Users do not need to complete the template for every single one of the habits and practices. They may want to focus only on the ones that stood out as strengths or areas for improvement on an ISAT or MPAT. After conducting an assessment identifying strengths and areas for improvement, the next step is to create an individual professional development plan, or IPDP. That includes training and development activities. We present two approaches for developing an IPDP and evaluating progress. The first approach focuses on tasks specific to job responsibilities and understanding how the habits and practices apply to those tasks. It allows a user to identify how to put the habits and practices to work and what may need to be done to improve them. The second approach focuses on specific habits and practices identified in the ISAT where improvement and further development is needed. The approach an individual takes is based on personal preference and in consultation with a mentor. If an individual prefers examining the habits and practices through the lens of specific job-related tasks, the task-oriented approach may make sense. If an individual would like to think through the habits and practices identified in the ISAT as areas for improvement, the habit-oriented approach can be used. I'll explain more details of each in the next slide. So this is an example of what the task-oriented form looks like. It is also available as a downloadable Word document. To begin, the user identifies 3 to 5 high-priority job-related activities or tasks for which significant progress over the next year is desired. Those tasks are listed in the first section of the template. Next, the habits and practices most relevant to the first task are marked in the second column. Not all the habits and practices will apply to each job-related task. In the additional columns, the user lists the opportunities and challenges that apply to each habit or practice, the actions taken to foster improvement, and any training or development activities that would be helpful for each job-related activity or task. There are also columns built in, so it's easy to revisit the form for 6-month and 1-year check-ins on progress. We provide some questions that can be asked at the time of evaluation in the guidebook. The habit-oriented approach focuses on specific habits and practices that can be improved. It is a bit more streamlined than the task-oriented approach. In this approach, users identify 3 to 5 of the habits or practices most in need of improvement over the next year, based on the responses of an ISAT, MPAT, or a CSAT. Those habits or practices are written in the first column of the template. Next, the user identifies a job-related activity for which each habit or practice is important. For each habit or practice, the user reflects on the opportunities and challenges related to improved application of them, and specific actions that can be taken to foster improvement. Like the task-oriented approach, there are columns for 6-month and 1-year check-ins. So I know I went through those tools very quickly. As I mentioned earlier, the Management Assistance team's website has a comprehensive guidebook that we put together that walks through the process for all of these tools. And as Kelly will go into a little more detail later in this webinar, Matt will be available to help with navigating all of these tools and materials. So I wanted to pause for a moment and see if anybody had some general questions at this time.
And feel free to either type them in the chat or unmute yourself and just chime in.
All right, well, I guess we can continue, and if you have any, put them in the chat. We'll be happy to answer them there.
All right, Chris, your turn to talk a little bit about using these tools with teams.
All right, thank you, Kelly, and good afternoon. When we started out this project, our focus was primarily on finding ways to improve the habits and practices of individuals in their particular work setting. But what we discovered as we were going through this process was that there were two additional applications that users might find of value. The first of those was in the process of either forming or evaluating and improving the performance of a team or work group, and the second related to the process of recruitment and selection. So I'm going to walk through how we can use these tools for those two processes. In forming a team, research has shown that a more diverse team functions more effectively than one that is more homogeneous. And if a manager is thinking about putting together a team, you can identify certain attributes of diversity, gender, ethnicity, and so forth, pretty obviously, and interviews or discussions may surface people's different experiences. But in order to take advantage of diversity in habits and practices that relate to reasoning and judgment, we recommend that managers use the tools that we've developed to form the team. To do that, you would ask prospective team members, first of all, to complete the individual self-assessment tool. That would provide the manager a good insight into the relative strengths of different team members and enable you to form a team that can leverage strengths of different team members and make sure that you've got all of the important areas covered within the team. You can also, once the team is formed, use or if you have a working group or team that has been together for some time, and you want to evaluate and improve team performance with respect to their reasoning and judgment, you'd have two different options for doing that. The first is to have each of the team members complete an individual self-assessment and then review those individually as a team manager with the team members to discuss their strengths and areas where they could improve their performance within the team, and to discuss collectively with the team what their relative strengths and areas of improvement are. We have also developed another tool that we call the Team Self-Assessment Tool, or the TSAT, which functions very similar to the individual self-assessment tool. The difference is with the team self-assessment, the team itself is the referent. And Kelly, if you could go to the next slide. In this case, it's very similar to the individual self-assessment, but you would identify the name of the team that you're evaluating, and then in response to that, identify whether the team members collectively typically need prompting to remember to perform in that fashion, or whether they sometimes put it into practice, or it's a common practice for the team. The results of that again, are compiled by the team manager, or could be compiled by the management assistance team, and are presented without attribution to individual team members. And we structured it that way to provide for a more candid input from the team members. But the team members and team leader can then use those results to get a better understanding of intra-team dynamics and identify areas where the team collectively could improve their performance. Once you complete either a collection of individual self-assessment or the team self-assessments, we would recommend that you also explore the possibility of using the context-specific assessment tool to develop a deeper understanding of the team's behavior. This process would be very similar to what Megan described for the individual, where the team could use this, the context-specific assessment tool as a means to really examine a particular project, or to undertake an after-action review to evaluate how the team's overall performance relative to the habits and practices of highly effective professionals affected their outcome. And once the context-specific assessment is done, we would recommend then that the manager work with the team to develop an improvement plan for the team, again, using the same form as the individual professional development plan, and the options of using either the task-oriented or habit-oriented approach will work equally well for the team. Now, as I mentioned, we also recognize the potential to use our findings with respect to the habits and practices in the recruitment and selection process. Now, one option, of course, would be to ask applicants for a position to complete an individual self-assessment tool, which would provide the hiring manager or selection committee with additional information on the individual. One caution that we would offer is that the incentive to inflate behavior in a hiring context may make this less valuable as a tool used directly in the hiring process. However, you can use the habits and practices and what we learned about the habits and practices to structure questions that you might ask in an interview or questions you might ask a reference. So, for example, you might ask an applicant to tell you about a time when they had to make a complex, challenging decision and how they went about doing that. And the ideal answer would reflect being constructively critical, exploring data and assumptions, and other information that provide the basis for a recommendation. You could also ask someone to tell you about a time when they had to make a complex or challenging decision, and an ideal answer would reflect seeking input from multiple sources and considering multiple potential outcomes as part of that process. In speaking with references, again, you can structure questions around the habits and practices, such as, in your experience working with the applicant, how would you describe his or her evaluating others' data, conclusions, or recommendations? Again, an ideal answer would reflect the applicant probes for deeper understanding and does not necessarily accept input uncritically. To accomplish those, I think if you review the document that Anne mentioned earlier, the in-depth analysis of habits and practices published by the Center for Conservation Social Studies at Cornell, you'd be able to build your own interview and reference questions and add that to your repertoire in recruitment and selection.
Awesome, thank you, Chris. So as you can see, there are lots of different applications of these tools, whether you're an individual or a team manager or a hiring manager. And so now we want to talk a little bit about now what's next. You've seen a lot of different tools here and a lot of different pieces to the puzzle. So we want to help you figure out what your next step is. So you can dive in yourself. As Megan mentioned, this guidebook is online as we speak, the Accelerating Development of Reasoning and Judgment User's Guide for Fish and Wildlife Conservation Professionals. It's there, it walks you through everything that we're talking about today, and all of these resources are available online, and I'll show you where. But as you can probably gather today, there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and we don't want you to feel like you're alone to sort them all out by yourself if you would like some additional support. So as Megan mentioned, the management assistance team can serve as a mentor for you in using these tools and support you in developing those individual professional development plans that we've taken a look at today. And we can also act as a third party to collect the multi-perspective assessment tools and the team self-assessment tools, and then return those to the individual or team being evaluated. So say you take an individual self-assessment tool and you want to kind of walk through those results with somebody. Say you're really good at being logical and systematic, but you might need to work on being adaptive and flexible. The management assistance team can sit down with you and look at those assessment results and think about what are the actions that you need to take to improve in those areas. And we would fill out those individual professional development plans with you. And as Megan and Chris have already mentioned, there is that task-oriented approach if you want to focus on a specific job-related activity. And there's the habit-oriented approach if you want to focus on specific habits and practices that you want to improve on as an individual or a team. I also want to highlight this resources for further reading about habits and practices that Megan put together. So you can see at the top where it says contents, those are the 5 clusters of habits and practices that Anne mentioned earlier. And then on the left, this is kind of the short and sweet cheat sheet of the habits and practices divided into the clusters. So you can see, for example, being constructively critical and skeptical is one of the habits and practices underneath the critically inquisitive cluster. So on the right with this resources for further reading, that is listed there, and it's all bulleted out with articles and videos such as giving constructive criticism using emotional intelligence, or 15 ways to offer truly constructive feedback. So this is all there for you to kind of go in yourself as you take an assessment. You can look to some of these resources to help you fill out that plan. But again, the management assistance team is here to kind of curate some of these resources for you and help point you in the right direction as you complete these assessments. And as you might already know, the management assistance team currently has many different types of professional development offerings, including online asynchronous courses, live and on-demand webinars. We have workshops in person before the pandemic, but also online in this day and age that we're living in. We offer consulting, and we also staff the National Conservation Leadership Institute. So to give you a couple examples of how these existing resources connect with developing these habits and practices, say interacting successfully with others is an area that you need to work on, you might want to check out our Leading with Empathy webinar. Or if practicing multi-level integrative systems thinking, which is all about being inclusive and being open-minded, is an area of improvement for you, you might want to check out our Power of Inclusion workshop that we're going to be rolling out later this year. So we can kind of help look at the assessments with you and then fill in the puzzle pieces to help you take those next steps to improve. And so you might have been thinking, if you were hearing Megan talk about the multi-perspective assessment tool, it can be nerve-wracking to hear what other people think about how you're doing, and it can also be intimidating to provide candid feedback about how do I think about how my coworker Bettina is performing in these areas. So as an added layer of to provide confidence in anonymity, the management assistance team can collect those multiple perspective assessment tools that people fill out to assess an individual or a team. And then we can use that master Excel spreadsheet that Megan mentioned to aggregate the data and then share the anonymous responses back. So just to show you kind of specifically what that looks like, if Megan fills this out about Sally, she'll fill it out and then she would send it to the management assistance team. and we'll put it in this spreadsheet. So it says what Megan thinks about how Sally's performing, and what Chris thinks, and what Anne thinks, and what Lindsay and Bettina think. And then it automatically populates into this histogram, which is like what Megan was showing you earlier. So you can feel more comfortable that Sally's not going to look back at those results and try to figure out, oh, well, Megan thinks, it's probably Megan who thinks that I'm not open-minded enough. And that's not where we want to go with this. So we are going to avoid that. So again, it's all there for you to do it yourself. A team leader can administer the multi-perspective assessment tool, or a supervisor or a mentor. But the management assistance team is also here to provide that kind of third-party service, if you will. So just to show you where all of these things are, this is our management assistance team webpage. When you go to the AFWA website, you click AFWA Inspires, you click management assistance team, and this is where you end up. So in the middle column, that how we serve, the second bullet from the bottom is accelerating reasoning and judgment skills. And you click that and it takes you here. And as you scroll down, you can see at the top, there's the guidebook, and that is where you go. That has all of the information. It goes into detail about the habits and practices, and it's your user's guide. And then beneath that, we have the checklists of habits and practices, and there's kind of that short and sweet graphic that I showed you earlier, and then there's a more detailed reference PDF. There's the resources for further reading that I showed you earlier. All the assessment tools in the Google form and Excel spreadsheets and Word documents and PDFs, it's all there. And then at the bottom, we have the individual professional development plan templates as well. And then if you continue to scroll down, we have a contact form. So you're attending this webinar today, you're kind of taking it all in. If you explore these things, and if you have questions, and if you want support using these tools, please contact us and we will get in touch with you and find the way that we can best support you in using these tools. So with that, again, I know there's a lot here. I want you to take a minute to think about, what do you think the next step is for you? Are you an individual who is excited about taking this individual self-assessment tool? Is that what you're going to do next? Are you a team manager thinking, oh, well, this could be helpful for my team. Let's look into having the team fill out the individual assessment tools. Or are you forming a team like Chris was talking about, and you want to use this to help make sure you have a diverse team members to better be able to be effective? Or are you a training manager and you want to use these resources more broadly with a large group of your staff? Go ahead, type it in the chat. What are you thinking about how you might use these? And I've put the link there, and I see that Lindsay has dropped it in the chat. That's where all of those resources are. So as you think about next steps, we'll send it back out for any questions that you might have at this time. And you can raise your hand, you can type in the chat, you can unmute.
Hi, Kelly, this is Dave Golden with New Jersey Fish and Wildlife. I have a question, or maybe it's a comment / suggestion. You mentioned that you'd be posting this instructional video on your webpage. Do you think it would be possible, and maybe this was your intent, to put it on the same page as you have all of the other resources? So if we're directing team leaders, it's kind of a one-stop shop where they can get the primer on how to use the tools at the same location as they can find the tools themselves?
Yes, that's exactly what we're planning on doing, Dave, and I'm glad you brought that up. That's where that same page is where this recording will live, and we'll have the video there so you can just play it right from that page.
Perfect, thanks.
Any other questions? All right, well, I see some folks typing in the chat about how they're planning on using these. Thank you, and please feel free to continue to do so. We do have a survey that we'd ask you to fill out, and Lindsay's gonna drop that link in the chat. That will be really helpful for us. It's just, I think, 5 questions, yes or no. So please fill that out. And if you have questions, as I mentioned, there's that contact form there, and you can also reach out to me, Kelly Reynolds. My email address is there, kreynolds@fishwildlife.org, and we will get your questions answered, and we're here again to support you. So thank you for attending. Please fill out the survey. We'll hang on for a few minutes in case there are additional questions. So I see Jeff's question about testimonials, and I'm going to ask Megan, Chris, or Ann to speak to that, because some states have gone through this already. So is that something you can speak to about people's experience with the tools?
So Kelly, I can address that. So Florida was one of the workshops that we did, and we brought in a wide variety of level of staff to sort of test these tools. And we've had really good responses of how folks are using these tools at an individual level and also at a team level. And as Chris mentioned, sort of these sort of after action assessments. And so we are actually using those.
Great, thank you, Ann.
So I guess to Jeff's point, maybe, Ann, we can capture some of those testimonials and perhaps Kelly can put them on the website. So I think that's a really good idea.
Yeah, I can capture those and provide those.
Awesome, thank you. And kind of on this front of suggestions, our goal is to make these useful to you and accessible. So any suggestions you have as you are interacting with the resources and the website, please let us know, and we will make adjustments to make them better and easier to use. Okay, any other questions? Final call? All right, well, again, thank you for attending. Email me, fill out that form. If you do have any questions that you think of, please fill out that survey, and we appreciate your time today. Thank you, Ann, Chris, Megan, Bettina, Lindsay, for all of your work. I know we did, well, just all the work that went into these tools, and then our planning to communicate about them. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Kelly. And I also want to thank AFWA for their support through the Multi-State Conservation Grant in 2019 that made all of this work possible. We really appreciate that.
And also for, hosting this information on the AFWA website. I think that's really critical to getting this information out to a wider audience and making sure that, folks have access to this information. So thanks to AFWA for that.
Well, on behalf of AFWA, you're welcome. I know that Bettina and I have talked about how we're so excited to add this to the suite of the management assistance team's resources, because having those assessment pieces is a new kind of piece of the puzzle to help us understand, what do people need to improve. So yeah, it's a win-win-win. All right, well, I think with that, I will stop the recording and we will sign off, and I wish you a happy Friday tomorrow and a nice weekend.
You too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.
Bye.
Bye.